Hello everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you who are listening in today. Today's talk is the third and final in the series on St. Thomas as the link between Edessa and Kerala. In the first talk, St. Thomas's role in the conversion of Edessa was discussed. In the second, 9 major reasons why Western historians over the past 300 years have been rejecting the St. Thomas tradition of the Syrian Christians of Kerala were discussed, and it was found that these 9 reasons were unsustainable evidence to reject the St. Thomas tradition, because in a critical analysis of them, it was found that there was considerable misunderstanding of terminologies and contexts in which these allegations were made, or their counterparts in Kerala as it was understood in the West. The 10th allegation, which I did not touch on in my second talk, was that of the stories all being of an aetiological nature. That is, the same story implying a single source and all copying from an archetypal text, in that sense discrediting the whole lot. So today's talk is on what exactly is the Syrian Christian narrative and how original is it, especially in terms of the different locations where St. Thomas evangelized, and is it a valid argument that each of the locations have got the same story, and hence that on that count the Syrian Christian narrative is to be rejected. After discussing these questions, I would also like to give a short critique on Western historiography in this regard. Most Western historians cite the shortage of evidence and shortage of literature as reliable sources in order to base their analysis on the subject. This is true to a great extent. There are not many literary sources. However, one of the handicaps most Western historians were under is that the literary sources in Kerala were often in the custody of private individuals, and they were often written in Malayalam, and often outsiders were not even aware of the existence of such literary texts. So with all these reasons combined, it is not surprising that many scholars had come to the conclusion that there is no literature and that they had to rely on the Mesopotamian literature called the Acts of Thomas. So what we find is that most historical analysis of the origins of Christianity in Kerala, in the whole of South India, is on the basis of this one book. Of course, they also use some of the, no, I wouldn't say all, but they all tend to use a few of the church fathers and travelers and other historians down the centuries who have made mention of Christian or finding Christians in southern India. Now, with the benefit of coming from Kerala and being able to speak Malayalam, I've been able to collate together and marshal about 19 sources, of which about 5 or 6 are primary sources, the rest being secondary. And the earliest of these is a letter written by an individual called Mathai Vettikunel in 1720. This is the earliest manuscript, original primary source I could find. And the second is the Niranam Chronicle, and immediately followed by the Kandanad Chronicle. They are also not very old. Niranam was written in the latter half of the 18th century and Kandanad in the late 19th century. And third manuscript that I have been able to locate is what is called the 1771 Ola. So that is a comprehensive account of Syrian Christians in Kerala. And the fourth is written by one of the priests called K.T. Zachariah, but he maintains that he copied vast sections of it from an Ola manuscript that used to belong to Chalakuri family. Unfortunately, I've not been able to locate the original manuscript, but I was able to locate Father Zachariah's original notes that went into the writing of this book. And the fifth is a fragment of an Ola called the Kartedata Ola. Apart from these, I've used several secondary sources, the majority of which say that they gained their material and their accounts from either a whole selection of Olas or individual testimonies. Now, these include Pugadi Litupwriter's book of 1869, E.M. Phillips' book on St. Thomas Christians, which was written at the end of the 19th century, but for various political reasons, it saw publication only in 1950. There are also two books by the very Reverend Kaniyamparambal Kurian Korepiscopa and an account by the CMS missionary Benjamin Bailey, and also the testimony that Idavarikal Philippos, one of the Syrian Christian priests, is thought to have written to an English minister who lived in Cambridge in the last quarter of the 19th century. Apart from these literary sources, I also consulted the extensive ballads that are one of the assets of the Syrian Christians, and these include long epic poems like Thoma Parvam or Ramban Pata, as well as shorter ballads called the Margam Kali Partigal, and put all these material, all these sources put together, agree on the fundamentals of St. Thomas's evangelical mission in Kerala. They are often very brief and abstract, and only when we get into the ballads, we see there is a continuous narrative and there are lots of details of St. Thomas's journeys and modes of transport, of named individuals that he encountered, and particular stories associated with miracles that the apostle performed in each of the locations, and quite often also the number of people who were converted. Now, this may sound at a very superficial level one of the reasons why these ballads or these elements of the ballad cannot be credited, because there are exact numbers given. This many people were converted. However, when we think that even in the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible, we see the Apostles, or St. Luke, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, often report X number of people were converted, 3,000 people were converted, etc. So perhaps that in itself is not a reason to discredit the ballads. Now, coming to the narrative that has always been prevalent in Kerala, and as far as I could see, this is the same narrative that has been reported to foreign visitors for hundreds and hundreds of years, as well as the one that I started seeing in what I called the Mathai Vettikunel manuscript in 1720. And according to this, in around the year 50 or 51 AD, St. Thomas was reluctant to go to India. And there is a king called Chora Perumal who ruled the kingdom of the Chora or Chola or Choras in southeastern India. And his name is given as Kandappa Raja or Kandaka Parashu. There are several different documents corroborate this name. And he saw a palace in his dreams of a splendid nature, and he desired to build a palace like that for himself. he sent one of his emissaries called Haban to Mesopotamia and Palestine to procure himself a master carpenter who would build him such a palace. Now, the reluctant Thomas is sold by Jesus to this emissary called Haban, and Haban brings Thomas back to Torah Perumal's palace. There the king gives him vast amounts of wealth and money and materials in order to build the palace, especially after the king was very pleased when, upon asking St. Thomas, he drew the palace the king had seen in his vision. So the king was assured that the apostle, or this master carpenter, knew exactly what he was going to build for him. So, entrusted with this work, the king went away on a pilgrimage journey and left the matter of building the palace in Thomas's hands. However, as soon as the king had left, the apostle went about preaching the gospel of Christ and distributing the king's funds to everyone. And it is in this phase of his mission that he boards a ship and comes around the point of India and lands in the port of Kodingalur. And according to consistent Syrian Christian narratives, this happened in the year 52 AD. And I have not been able to ascertain whether the apostle remained in Kerala for the next 20 years. The only thing one can gather from the sources is that he left about the year 70, and about the year 72 he was martyred again back in the east coast, that is in the Chora kingdom. So what happened in those 18 years? We have a fairly comprehensive account of the apostles' travels. So the first instance is in Palayur, which is a northern town just south of the city of Trichur. Here the narrative goes that St. Thomas challenged a group of Brahmins who were bathing in the temple tank, and St. Thomas challenged them, saying asking them whether their chanting the mantras, standing waist deep in water, had any benefit, or whether it was efficacious in their prayers. The Brahmins in turn challenged St. Thomas to perform a miracle, and he did so, which was amazing. And the Brahmins are thought to have climbed out of the tank, and some fled the place, saying, first of all, Thomas had polluted by his presence the temple, the pond, and the premises, whereas some others fell at his feet and followed the apostle from that point onwards. The 10 named families are thought to have been converted in Palayur itself, and some of the sources name these families. The second location is Kodingalur itself, and here there lived many Jews and Brahmins, and St. Thomas converted many of them, and again named families are mentioned, especially not of the Jewish people, but from among the Brahmins of Kerala. The third location is Paravur or Otakava. Here St. Thomas arrived during the festival of Kali at the local temple, and an angry crowd attacked him for polluting the temple premises by his presence, and St. Thomas is said to have performed one of his most amazing miracles in this place. He commanded the goddess Kali to come out of her inner sanctum, and seeing her, the devotees apparently fled in terror. And then there was a storm, and a banyan tree that was growing in the front of the temple toppled over, and again the people fell down at his feet and became converts to Christianity. Many important clans are thought to have been converted at this place, and they are given their names of Kottakavi, Menavaseri, Chembaseri, Chettiyadan, etc. The fourth place is again further south along the coast from Kodingalur, and this is called Gokamangalam, and apparently he arrived there by canoe in the year 56 AD. However, we have no details from this location. And the fifth place is Niranam, and here we have a lot of details. He arrived here in the year 58 AD, and word spread even before he arrived that in Malayalam, Vadakare Kurishi Divichavan Vanirikinu, Avane Vidaninnum Kadathanam. That means the man who made people wear the cross is coming to our country, and we shall get rid of him somehow. So Thomas was staying in Niranam in the family, in the household of a barber here, and soon the barber's son died, and the crowd gathered again, wanting to lynch the apostle, accusing him of having murdered the child. However, the apostle held the child up and brought him back to life, and the child declared that it was his father who had killed him. And here 6 clans, altogether 600 people, 600 individuals, are thought to have immediately converted to Christianity and followed St. Thomas. And these include the clans of Mangi, Madathil, Patamukka, Tayyal, Mattekal, and Pallatara. And the 6th place was Kurakeni Kollam, again going further down south. And here the story is that the ruler of Kollam sent an emissary to the apostle, begging him to come to his palace because he was paralyzed and his son was mentally ill. The apostle came to the palace and cured both of them of their afflictions. And the king gave him land to build a church, and many were converted. There are no further details about this. Now, after closely examining these sources, it dawned on me that St. Thomas had come to Kerala only in the year, to southern India, that is year 51, he arrived in the Chora kingdom. So between the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension of Jesus and his point of arrival in South India, 18 years certainly appear to have elapsed. So there is a possibility that one of the contentions that Western historians have put forward is in fact correct, that St. Thomas went to Parthia and Media. And so it is quite possible that these 18 years were spent by the apostle evangelizing and preaching the gospel in these regions. As we know, Parthia is the land that lies to the west of the river Indus, whereas to the east it is India. Anyhow, once he came to the Chora Perumal's kingdom, he spent the major part of that mission in Kerala, but he may also, according to some sources, have gone to China and the Far Eastern regions. But I have not gone into those details. What I would like to do now is to examine some of the Western sources, as in Mesopotamian, Syrian, Palestinian, the general region that we call the Levant. What have historians written about the St. Thomas tradition of southern India? From the 2nd to the 6th centuries, there have been innumerable references to St. Thomas's evangelical activities. In fact, the earliest we have are several documents, not one, and I have mentioned this in my first talk on Edessa. And this is where William Cureton of the British Museum translated documents, Syriac documents that he rightly concludes were written between 60 and 85 AD. That is in the 1st century itself. And one of the texts in this is called the Didascalia, or the Doctrine of the Apostles. And here it says, India and all its countries and those bordering it received the apostles' hand of priesthood from Judas Thomas, who was guide and ruler in the church which he built there. And successive historians make mention of this, but of course India is only one among Parthia, Media, etc. So Parthia, Media and India are often stated together. So there is always the name India occurring in these narratives. Otherwise, there is also one other discrepancy, which is that some early historians mention that he was martyred and buried in Kalamina. Now, in my second talk, I did analyze this narrative, and I was able to explain that Kalamina was a misapprehension of the two places called Kalamina and Mylapore. Kalamina being the same city, but where there was a sea surge at some point, and the major part of the city was washed away into the sea. And Mylapore is the next nearest place, and the Syrian Christians believe that St. Thomas's tomb is in Mylapore. Now, coming to the 4th century, the greatest testimony we have and witness we have is that of St. Ephrem. St. Ephrem died in 373 AD. So what he says about St. Thomas could only have happened before that. Again, I did mention this in the second talk. St. Ephrem sings many, or he's composed many, as in scores of hymns regarding St. Thomas. He talks of St. Thomas being the light that shone like a bright ray of sunshine in the dark land of pagan India. And also he mentions that in his lifetime, that is before he died obviously, St. Thomas's relics were translated from Mylapore and brought to Edessa. So that is more or less conclusive evidence from a very reliable source, from one of the greatest saints and hymnodists who lived in the 4th century AD. Another interesting source we have is that of King Alfred the Great of England. King Alfred lived in the 9th century, and according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which are the English kingdom's ancient history, written and stored in the British Library. According to this document, in the 9th century, when King Alfred the Great was about to confront the Danes in a very decisive war, the Danes were far, far stronger than his own army. So King Alfred is thought to have made a vow that he would send offerings to the tomb of St. Thomas in India. And when he won this war against the Danes, he did send 2 or 3 named people. Their names are in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and very briefly, of course, that they went to St. Thomas's tomb and came back with spices. That is as far as it goes. So there is a 9th century testimony, and historians like Bishop Medlicott and the Jesuit historian Hostin and several others have compiled whole lists of historians from antiquity and early medieval period who have all attested to the St. Thomas tradition of Kerala. Coming to the late medieval period, from the 12th to the 15th century, many more historians who had actually come to southern India and visited or stayed in Kollam and Mylapore have written about this tradition. And the names that are famous in this context are the Catholic friar called Marignoli and Jordanus, and of course the even more famous mercantile traveler called Marco Polo, who also came to Kerala as well as to Mylapore and witnessed the miracles that were going on, and also heard from locals what the narrative was that the local Indians believed. So far, the discussion was on the Syrian Christian tradition of St. Thomas, which appears to be well documented and well attested by a whole variety of evidence from olas and local living legends, and also a series of historians, travelers, and church fathers for the past 700 years. Now, from all that has been discussed so far, it appears fairly certain that the St. Thomas tradition of the Syrian Christians, and in general in southern India, is one that has been well documented and well attested by a whole variety of evidence, those that are in olas and the local living legends, which were established in the very first century and passed down generationally, and the appointment of certain priestly families, the lineage of which still continues to the present day, and also finally that we saw that reports received in Europe were from a series of first-hand witnesses, like the friars who visited in the late medieval period. It then raises the question as to why the dominant narrative in academic circles in Western universities have rejected the South Indian tradition. What is baffling is that the academic circles do not take into account the local narratives, the local legends, and the local ballads. Of course, there is a hindrance to access them because of the language of Malayalam. However, the language barriers have been overcome in almost every other instance. There are Malayalam scholars all over the world, in fact. So even now in the 21st century, this remains the dominant Western narrative, which is baffling to anybody who has studied the local traditions in southern India. Well, not one. There are several explanations that are given as to why the Syrian Christian tradition is not reliable, is unhistorical and unreliable, and they do not make a very edifying reading. It is alleged that what the Syrian Christians say is merely fruits of a fertile imagination of the local people, or that they are borrowed from this Edessan or Mesopotamian stories, especially the stories contained in the Acts of Thomas, or that they had created them out of elements taken from various different sources and made a composite narrative for themselves for various obscure reasons. These are, as I mentioned in my first talk, serious challenges. I have presented here only a very small part of the results of my extensive investigations into this vexing subject. Much more can be seen on my website called Malankara Research. I would like to close this discussion with a brief look at what might be the underlying cause of this trajectory of Western historical assessment of the St. Thomas tradition in Kerala and in southern India in general. St. Thomas Christians of Kerala and Mylapore are seen to be demanded documentation from the apostolic era as proof of their claims. While they are ready to accept the tradition of all other apostles, this, as in St. Peter in Rome, or St. Mark in Alexandria, or St. John in Ephesus, all these accounts are received as authentic historical accounts. Only St. Thomas's account, there is a demand for documentation, and documentation does not exist for any of the apostles and their activities derived from the very first century. So, in formulating my own personal assessment of this dominant academic trend among Western church historians, I have relied primarily on Edward Said's Orientalism and Gayatri Spivak's subaltern theories of historical narratives. This is a colonialistic approach to history writing, and in such a history writing, first of all, subject peoples are declared to be without a history. Secondly, the Western historian then manufactures a history by taking elements from whatever suits his own hypothesis. And thirdly, this historian gives this history to the subject people. When the subject people or nation put forward their own history, they are, after much critical analysis, rejected and dismissed on the grounds of it being, two words here, teleological or apologetic. Teleological is where you are at an end point in history and you look back and backwrite your history, where every element of your historical progress is directed at arriving at the final point from where you are writing. And apologetic is of a similar vein, where a historian alleges on a native people or a subject people that they are trying to prove something, and so they manufacture the histories. This is where we are at an inquiring into the origins and progress of Christianity in southern India in the 21st century in Western academic circles. And I think this is a sad state of affairs. I can only hope that the next generation of scholars will come from South India and that they will have the courage to stand firm on the traditions of southern India and take this research forward. Thank you very much for listening.
താൻ വേഗം